Welcome to the Munro Review, where it's all about connecting, sharing, and valuing the arts in the central San Joaquin Valley. I'm Donald Munro. Today is April 9th. I am, of course, still not in the CMAC studio, but practicing social distancing in my home office. But it sure looks like we're getting closer to the time we'll be back in studio. On today's show, I have a special in-depth interview for you. It's with the noted photographer Bruce Haley, whom some of you might recall from two exhibitions a few years ago at the Fresno Art Museum. The first volume of his new two-book series focuses on Haley's childhood landscape in the Lemoore area. These are the kind of photographs that take on added significance once you learn more and think about them as a body of work. It's a great interview. Before we get to that, let me remind you of some of the stories I've been covering on MunroReview.com. One of my favorite pieces of the past month is an interview I did with Broadway dancer Angelo Soriano, who is part of the cast of Disney's Aladdin. He spent his formative years in Visalia, and he returned to star in a special music video he made with the Sequoia Symphony. It was filmed at the Vintage Press Restaurant and the Fox Theater. Soriano, who went to El Diamante High School, choreographed and wrote the story for the 9-minute film. The orchestra recorded Leonard Bernstein's Fancy Free at a studio beforehand. It is a top-notch production, and Soriano is a top-notch guy with a lot of talents, including video photography. His interview is fun and thoughtful and makes you tired just thinking about all he accomplished during the pandemic. In other stories, I wrote about a juried online art exhibition dedicated to the work of women artists. Visions of Self was sponsored by Yosemite Sierra artists. Of the 117 featured artists, about half are from California. The rest come from across the U.S. and 9 other countries. You can see the winners at yosemitearts.com. Now, let's get to our feature interview. Bruce Haley is a former war correspondent who is keenly aware of the nuances of the landscapes around him. In his new book, Home Fires, he returns to his childhood stomping grounds to explore how the environment has changed and how it's remained the same. Haley talked to me from his home in Modoc County at the tippy top of California. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I have the pleasure today to talk to Bruce Haley, who has a new photographic book out that's called Home Fires. This is the first volume of the book, and it is really a reflection on the landscape of the Central Valley. Welcome, Bruce. Thank you for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, I'm just curious, how do you describe yourself? Are you a documentary photographer, a landscape photographer? What do you do?
I'm going on, 33 years doing this now, and I don't describe myself. I've done so much different type of work over the years that I'm not much into labels.
So I should probably ask you where you are. The book is about the Central Valley, but you're in it right now.
I'm still in California, but I live in just about the far northeast you can get and still be in the state.
Just to give our listeners a little bit of background on what you've done in those 3+ decades of photography, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I didn't start out to be a photographer, and actually didn't start my photography career until age 31. Prior to that, I was in the Army and I worked in law enforcement. And at some point I decided to take what had become a real passion for photography, which developed later in life, and combine it with, my experience that I'd had up to that point. And I started out as a conflict photographer and went from basically war zone to war zone for quite a while. Did a lot of work for major magazines and developed into doing long-term documentary projects. And, like I say, 33 years later, I'm still still at it in some form or another. So
just a little bit of background for people who might recognize your name from your show that you had at the Fresno Art Museum. How is that show different from the work that you have in your new book?
Actually, I've had two shows at the Fresno Art Museum. The first show was more based around what would later become my previous book to these two, called Sunder, which was 8 years worth of work in the former Soviet Union and Iron Curtain countries. So there was a show of that work at the Fresno Art Museum, and then I also did a series of large format panoramic images that dealt with the mining industry and that sort of thing in Nevada.
I still have it on my bucket list to go to Tonopah. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
This little mining town that in Nevada that looks fascinating. So I'm still going to make it there. I promise.
There you go.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your new book. You grew up outside of Lemoore, and in your introduction, you talk about this. And I'm wondering if we could get you to read a little of that introduction for us.
So I've written the introductions to both volumes. So I'll read the first section from the San Joaquin Valley book, titled The Child. I remember the fish and the desperation. As the water evaporated, scores of them would be forced into small, shallow, muddy puddles. Even from a distance, you could see the frenzy. Mouths, tail fins, dorsal fins, pectoral fins, visible above the surface, all pressed together, frantic, flipping and writhing and glistening in the intense heat of a San Joaquin Valley summer afternoon. If they were lucky, someone, somewhere, whoever controlled the water, would open up the flow before the puddles dried completely. In most cases, this last-minute reprieve never arrived. As a 10-year-old, I wouldn't have known the term riparian zone, but in retrospect, I understand and appreciate the vital role that several such areas played in my life. They fueled my boyhood imagination and my need to explore, and provided refuge and solace from events in my everyday life that were beyond my control. The South Fork of the Kings River arced around our property. In reality, it was little more than a glorified irrigation ditch, existing solely to deliver water to farmers. One in the area referred to it simply as the canal. But it had rushes and cattails, and the banks had trees and were overgrown with bushes and brambles and weeds. A short distance upstream, there was a small weir. In a matter of minutes, I could leave the house, cross the back pasture past the huge valley oak, climb the small levee, slip between the strands of a barbed wire fence, all alone in my private riparian sanctuary. Even better, about half a mile away, as the crow flies, was my wilderness place, big to the eyes of a boy, full of mystery and ripe for exploration, where glimpses of owls and possums and foxes were possible. Tangled, forgotten, untouched, it was a rare tract of land even then, a relic in an area where most every piece of ground was made productive. To get to my wild place, I had to follow dirt roads past fields of cotton or alfalfa or corn, and then pass through a walnut orchard and along a concrete-lined irrigation ditch. From there, I would cross an overgrown field that still bore the telltale signs of previous cultivation, and only then would I have arrived in my wilderness. Growing up in an agricultural area, property and boundaries are everything, and the demarcations are seared into your psyche. With each step along the way, I would be conscious of whose property I was walking through. Here is Fagundes land, then Roberts land, Brown land, Stone land. I was never certain who owned my forgotten place, but its days were already numbered, and it didn't survive much past my childhood. Nothing lasts, and every single gasping fish dies. I grew up and moved on, gone like those wild creatures in my relic wilderness that were driven before the tractor and the harrow.
As a child, do you think you lived in a place that was beautiful?
Yes, no question.
And that's interesting because I didn't really think much about where I grew up. But it sounds like you might have thought a little bit more about where you grew
I
up?
had the contrast because I wasn't born in the San Joaquin Valley. I was born in Alameda in the Bay Area. So at age 10, when my dad retired, we moved to this place in the valley. I had gone from living in a city to that. And at age 10, to all of a sudden have that freedom to roam and all that open space, that was wonderful. I loved it. It was absolutely delightful.
And it's something that most kids really don't get much of a chance to do these
Right.
days. It's just to roam. It's just different times.
Yeah, I considered myself, and still do consider myself, quite lucky.
Let's talk about some of the images in your book. One of the things that you notice when you're looking at your book, looking through your book, is that some sort of human element in just about every image. Sometimes it's very dominant, and sometimes you have to look really close. But can you talk about that? Can you talk about what it was like to kind of go off on this memory quest to take these images, and what it was like trying to depict that?
I think one of the things we need to discuss, there is an aspect of memory there. I hadn't lived in the San Joaquin Valley for decades when I went back and did this work, but it was also sort of time specific. I wanted to photograph at the height of the drought and also during winter. So there was a combination of winter and drought. The painter Andrew Wyeth talks about winter in that you can feel the bone structure of the landscape. So that was something I was really looking for. You know, the memory aspect of it was, I went back to the areas that I was most familiar with for the most part. So there is, you know, the threads probably running through the book are, you know, not only the memory aspect and the winter and the height of the drought, but there's you know, the way water is transported through the valley. There's a thread, kind of a sub-thread of the decline or difficulties with the dairy industry at the time. The aspect of, you know, what we leave behind in place, and just sort of an overall investigation of open space in the valley as it is at present.
I take it it's difficult, no matter where you are in this area, to even find a scene that doesn't have some sort of human presence, whether it's industrialization or a road or a power pole or whatever.
It was. I was, as I was assembling the book, the edit and the sequence, you know, you come to realize just how difficult it is to take a photograph there that does have some evidence of the man-altered landscape. People who don't follow photography history, it's very much in the vein of what they call the new topographics movement. The name comes from a exhibition in 1975. It was at the International Museum of Photography, the George Eastman House, Eastman Kodak fame. It was called New Topographics. And at the time, it was this sort of drastic shift away from the normal photographic depiction of landscape. It was people like Robert Adams examining the spread of suburbs in Denver along the Front Range, and Louis Baltz photographing the building of industrial parks and that sort of thing. People hated it, but it turns out that this has become like one of the most influential exhibitions in photographic history. We're almost half a century on from it. So this book, especially this first volume about the valley, is very much in the new topographics vein.
Well, let's talk about one of those images in particular. It's one of the images early on in the book. This is not a photo or an image that a tourist would walk into the Yosemite Art Gallery and say, I want to buy this, right? What was it about the composition of the scene that drew you?
The whole book, it's a documentary look into, you know, mostly the idea of open space in the valley and what we talk about the man-altered landscape. But it's small, normal places. You know, what people can look at that picture and say, I drive by something that looks like that every day.
So you mentioned the dairy industry. This is one of the images that I was drawn to. Tell us about that dairy.
At the time, I think the dairy industry was hard hit. I wanted to show distress in the dairy industry. That's sort of one of the sub threads in the book.
And one of the things you kind of reflect upon too with your images is that even when something gets torn down or abandoned, it's still there. At least within our lifetimes, the remnants we leave really kind of leave a story behind.
I mean, the notion of remnants and what we leave behind, it's sort of a recurring thread throughout my work. Something that's been left behind or abandoned, and it looks, on the surface, it looks ugly, it's an eyesore. But if you think a little farther into it, there was dreams, there was work, and something happened there. There's stories behind these places as well. So
this next image, and this is a tricky one. I actually looked at this for quite a long time, and I never saw the human element until you pointed it out to me.
I went to a number of refuges and preserves and places like that, looking for locations where there wasn't any indication of the man-altered landscape. But there's also like this big marshy pond with big, huge power pylons going right through the middle of it. That photograph you're talking about, if you look in the very far distance in the horizon line, you can see one of those big power pylons.
You mentioned power poles, and this is, to me, this is kind of just an example of how something as ordinary as a power pole and a road can create this kind of dynamic feel to it, to an image.
It sort of has that vanishing point perspective.
This image, it has the power poles, it has the oil derrick. Those are kind of two almost ubiquitous things in some parts of the valley, right?
Sure. Actually, the oil hills and all that's kind of been a pretty popular subject for photographers.
There's something very organic about it, like they're little insects going,
right?
bobbing their heads.
I remember when I used to drive back and forth when I was going to college in Coalinga, they had a number of them decorated where they had animal heads on the top of the derrick. It was pretty clever. They were fun.
So when we're talking about what we leave behind, you took an image that, and I'll show the preceding image. This is kind of a wider shot. Tell us about this location, and then let's talk about this this close-up that you took in that back room.
Basically, it was a dairy that was in the process of being dismantled. It was abandoned, and that's first one you showed is sort of a view down the center of a milking shed. Second photo you showed is just a close-up of the wall. It's interesting to find these little vestiges, these little traces of the human history in a place that's, soon to be probably completely demolished. So
and you think about even that scene with the back room scene, there was a lot of human hours spent in that spot. It kind of reminded me of that there's kind of an entropy that is involved with anything we build. The second we build it, and we constantly have to be repairing and renovating.
Right, and that's the story is at what point does that reach the tipping point where you can no longer put that money into the maintenance or refurbishment that's necessary and you have to let it go.
Right. If you're lucky enough and you're a building, you become a historic landmark, and then people spend jillions of dollars trying to maintain you in your original state. But otherwise, you just get sort of left alone. You have a number of images that show how people live amongst industry, whether it be dairy or even, we're talking about oil and energy. Tell us about this image.
It's a place I sort of found by accident. It kind of sits out in the middle of nowhere, and there were silos behind it, a number of pieces of abandoned equipment, although part of it, I suspect, by the silos was still being used regularly, but the houses had been let go and were boarded up. And so it was one of those, probably, I would guess, an in-between place where part of that space was still being used, at least to park equipment and things, while the actual residence had been, the residences had been long abandoned.
And again, there were people who lived there who have incredible memories associated.
At some point in time, there were probably laughing kids running through there, and people were having a good time, and they'd barbecue out in the front when it was warm. I mean, it was life. It was family at one point in time, and that's gone. And where has it gone?
This is just one image that jumped out at me, and I don't know why. I just like the composition, I guess, is what draws me to that. But there's something that's very stark and almost hypnotic about.
Yeah, and then you can take that and run with it just literally, and that it's the California aqueduct. That's why one of the sub threads of this book is the way that water moves through the valley. There's a few pictures of the big aqueduct, but there's also smaller concrete lined ditches and smaller ditches and creeks and things like that.
And people who study the environment, they'll tell you that the Central Valley is one of the prime examples of how a topography has been changed by humans in terms of us diverting water, building all this stuff. But to be able to take this land and transform it into such a major agricultural area, it's pretty impressive. So this image, this is another one that leapt out at me. And I think part of it is just because it's a very familiar sight. These roads that suddenly just veer around. But the way you've captured it, particularly with the light, just kind of gives it this ethereal feel. Like this road is on the way to somewhere that's not normal or something like that.
Like I say, it's a documentary look. I want people to drive around the more rural areas of the valley to say, I've seen that, or a place like that. And that picture, I think, is a good example of that. Like you mentioned, those of us who live here have driven past things like that a million times. It's interesting because it makes the curve. There's sort of a dip, which is a little different than some of those curves like that. But, you can also see the traces of tire tracks going off into the dirt in that picture. And there's a lot of small things happening in it if you spend some time with the image and really look at the details. And that's the point of a lot of the images in this book. You don't just go through it once and everything hits you in the face and you're done. That you can go back and engage with it and get more out of it as you go in and dig and spend a little more time with it. So
I think this book helps you sort of look at the world in just a little bit different way. As you're driving down a road that you always drive down, you glance over and you see this, really well composed scene, or you see how the power poles are lining up. And so I think that's another impact as well. So I wanted to show this one because this is an interesting sort of companion to that other road curve piece, because it shows this curve and then a straight skid mark.
Right. There's a human story behind that picture, but it's left for you to guess what it is.
And then finally, I wanted to show this abandoned trailer. It's a very striking image. There's a little bit more color in it than some of your other images. And I wanted to ask you about that, about the way you work with light. What can you tell us about that? Because you do have a color palette throughout the book.
That's it exactly. I had a very specific color palette in mind for this. One of the reasons I shot during winter, and I wanted the color palette of this book to really sort of reflect a weaker winter light in the valley when there's no crops, things are fallow, the grasses are dead. If you really look at what that light looks like, it's not this super saturated, super drenched color that we see in a lot of photography these days.
And how does that compare to where you live now? If you were to compare those two places in that same season?
There are similarities because, a weaker winter light and the dead grasses do have a certain, there's a certain subdued palette to that. So, it's high desert, all high desert to the east of me. If you go to the west of me, behind my place, there's a mountain range, there's aspens. Of course, you get, beautiful color in the fall with that. But, there are some similarities.
What was your frame of mind, or your emotional frame of mind?
I enjoyed revisiting it, but obviously there's been a lot of changes in the valley since I moved out of there. But, there has been a lot of changes. And when you go back, or keep going back to visit family or friends, you see the growth, you see the changes that come with that. We do have to deal with it. And can't ignore it. And there are aspects of this book that are, kind of examinations of that sort of thing.
And tell us a little about the second volume.
Basically, the premise of this, it's a 2-volume set. And the premise is, both books are home fires, from the old phrase, keep the home fires burning. And what they were sort of meant to be was, someone, myself, who has spent the bulk of his career working in faraway places, with all the war work and the long-term documentary work overseas and all of that, turning and kind of pointing my lens towards something I'm familiar with. So the subtitles of the 2 volumes are the past and the present. The past is where I grew up, the areas I spent the most time in the Valley. The present, the second volume, is about where I'm living now. Very simple premise. The Valley book was shot over a much shorter period of time because I specifically wanted, the height of the drought and the winter light. So normally my books, the book prior to that was 8 years worth of work. The second volume of Home Fires is 7 years worth of work. So the Valley's a much shorter time period, very specific focus for a certain look. The second volume is going to be broader in scope. There'll be some people in it, ranch work, but it basically describes a seasonal arc here, in that it's the late dry season, sort of fire season. Fire season in the Intermountain West has become horrible, and so there's photographs. It starts out with photographs of burn scars, because we all breathe a collective sigh of relief when fire season is over, when it's finally over and winter's coming. So it kind of starts out with that. It starts out with some of the ranches and the cowboys bringing their cows back from the high desert grazing allotments. Some of them, the photographs in the book, are them using part of the old Applegate Pioneer Trail. So that it's still in use, after, all these years. And then the book moves up into, the harsh of the winter, the snow and the ice, and then kind of goes into the thaw and melt time. So it's very, very much a seasonal arc.
Well, thank you, Bruce, for taking the time to talk with me today. It is it's a remarkable book, and like you say, it's one of those books that you have to sit down with a couple of times to really sort of absorb the subject in its entirety. And I will tell you that it has made me kind of look at my own homescape a little differently. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me on, Donald. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bruce, for sharing your project with us. Now let's talk about some of the events coming up. The Fresno Philharmonic finishes its digital masterwork season with the premiere of its Bach to the Future concert on Saturday, April 17th, featuring music director Ray Hatoda and the orchestra's musicians, recorded at Shikoyan Hall. Fresno State offers a digital version of the play Agony of Ecstasy. The 2-weekend run begins May 7th. Well, that wraps it up for this edition of the Munro Review on CMAC. Special thanks to guest Bruce Haley, to producer Kyle Lowe, and to editor Marcela Hernandez. Finally, for all of you, please keep exploring and supporting the local arts scene. We'll see you next time.